Hi, Andy. You are a design leader. You founded Clearleft, a well-known British design agency. You later sold it to become advisor at Seedcamp. Quite successful venture fund, I think, investing in early stage startups. So what keeps you busy these days?
I mean, that's a great introduction. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm doing two things at the moment. So I come from a design background and I've long been an advocate for design. I want more designers to be hired in companies. I want to see more designers become leaders of teams. Ideally, I'd like more designers to become founders of companies and CEOs. And so I guess a lot of what I'm doing at the moment is sort of combined around trying to empower designers, get designers have a seat at the table, and when they've got that seat at the table, have an impact. So I guess half of my time is spent still with one foot back in the design leadership world. So I do coaching. I coach around 15 design leaders, heads, directors and VPs of both product and design actually. And these are all people that are leading design in their organizations, but they want to make a bigger impact. So they want to be able to raise the profile of design, they want to be able to make sure that research is being done, they want to be able to demonstrate that design can deliver value to the business. And so they'll reach out to me and we'll have regular conversations where I help them try and think through how to address some of the challenges and how to position design and themselves as being sort of change makers. And then I guess I also have come to the realization that through a lot of those conversations, it's just really hard being a design leader in a well-established company, particularly if the company hasn't been caring about design straight from the start. And so I guess I realized that I wanted to try and figure out a way that I could get design with a seat at the table at the start of a business. And so the best way to do that was to go and join the VC world, join an early stage VC company or fund where at Seedcamp we invest in a pre-seed and seed stage companies. So usually we're the first investment that company has from a fund. And my goal partly is to try and work with founders to get them to realize the power that design can have. And so I will help them find good design talent. I'll help them realize the value of hiring those people. I'll help them understand that design is an integral part of reaching product market fit and beyond. You know, particularly I think over the last recent years, we've seen the rise of product-led growth. How by making changes to the product, you can help the product scale and grow, which is, you know, one of the fundamental things that founders want to do. And so a lot of my work at Seedcamp is advising those early stage founders on how to get product market fit, how to utilize product market, product-led growth, how to hire, how to build that culture, and how to embed good design practices and good development practices and discovery practices into their culture from day one, because it's much better to do that from day one rather than to do it in 2, 3, 4 years time.
Wow. When you talk about like really influencing those companies to really embrace design, do you have any success story from recently where that really helped, maybe changed the course of the startup or really transformed the way it works in a major way?
Yeah, I mean it's difficult. I mean, I think as a advisor to startups, really it's the startups who are owning their future. And I think it would always be a little bit kind of presumptuous for me to say, well, you know, I've had a major effect and I've kind of turned the tide. In reality, you know, what I'm like is I'm like a kindly uncle to the startup, and I can maybe guide and nudge people in the right direction, but it's their job to kind of make the decisions. But on saying that, you know, I work with a lot of companies who, I mean, it's a fairly common process actually. You have a vision for a product, you really feel strongly that it's going to be a success. You spend, you know, a year or whatever raising money and building the product, and then you launch it, and it doesn't go quite as according to plan. You expected that there'd be hockey stick growth. You'd expect that as soon as people saw it, they'll be knocking down the door. But often it doesn't happen like that. Often it's much slower, and often it requires you to kind of reassess your assumptions that you made around your product and your users and your customers, and then maybe maybe sort of, sometimes it's a fundamental pivot, sometimes it's a subtle tweak. But a lot of the work that I do with companies is around like once they've launched, if it's not going as well as they hope for, what do they need to do? And a lot of it is just good design practice. It's going and talking to customers and really understanding the need and listening to them. I think a lot of the time founders will have an idea of what they want to build in the marketplace, and then they will go out and talk to customers and get confirmation bias. But it's much more important to kind of set aside what you think the right solution is, go out with an open mind and really, really listen to what people are saying. And I think if you do that, you can gain a real insight into what the customer and the user's needs. And so, yeah, I've been in several situations with companies. Can't really name any names. It wouldn't be fair to kind of talk about pivots or challenging sort of situations that companies have found themselves in. But I've been in a number of situations where they've hit a crunch point, they've had a bit of a challenge, they've applied a bit of design thinking, they've talked to customers, they've reassessed what they're going to do. They put more thought into the product, the onboarding experience, the value that it's going to deliver, and then suddenly you start seeing things climbing up in the way that they were hoping. So yeah, it's quite a common experience, I think.
And do you follow some like rigid methodology, or do you have some design process that you like repeat and tell the startups to follow, or is it more about really understanding the situation of the startup and maybe just recommending a specific method or so?
So I think there's a big difference between sort of accelerators and incubators and then funds. And so you generally find that if you're applying to an accelerator, the accelerator will have a very, very defined process. This is what we do on day one, this is what we do on week two, this is what we do. And often accelerators are designed to help people who have never been an entrepreneur before. And so often that process can be really helpful. I'm working with people that may be a little bit sort of further down the line. They've already sort of started building their solution. They have some sort of fairly firm ideas. So really, I'm not designing it for them. What I am doing is I'm being an advisor. And so mostly I'm there to help them solve problems when they have problems come up. So quite often, like I'll have a call with each one of my companies that I'm looking after every couple of weeks. And each week they might come to me and say, "Oh, Andy, we've got this different problem. Have you got any thoughts?" And I'll chat and I'll help them understand what the problem is and go, "Well, I've seen some companies do this. I'm going to go some companies do that." So it's very much advice. It's very much kind of sort of coaching and advisory work rather than a full-on design process. Obviously, when I was previously at Clearleft, we had a full, proper design process. But even then, I think when it comes to designers working in a product environment, I think the real skill is to have a toolbox of tools you can draw upon. And you understand what each tool does, and then you can apply the right tool for the job. So it's like a carpenter. Like if you have all the chisels and the hammers and the mallets and the 15 different saws, whenever you hit a particular problem, you know the right tool for the job. And so you don't really have a process in a very rigid way because each problem you get given might be slightly different. I think rigid processes work if you're delivering the same thing. If you're stamping out widgets on a production line, if you're building every product is a 4-week sprint to deliver an iPhone app, and it's with a very rigid kind of use case, then I think you can have a process. And obviously things like design sprints are sort of a rigid process that's a sort of a boiling down of the kind of the design thinking approach. I think with me and with Clearleft, like we would largely follow the classic kind of double diamond in that you go and do a bunch of discovery work, you talk to a bunch of people, you understand the domain space, you talk to stakeholders, you do some desk research, you plot out all of your ideas on a wall, you start building those connections, you start generating lots of ideas that might be suitable for solving those problems. And then once you've generated a lot of ideas, then you narrow down and you start going, okay, well, of all of these ideas, of all of this data we're exploring, we're going to focus in this area. And then once you've got an area you focus on, then you do the process again. You prototype, you create wireframes or animatics or some other kind of manifestation of the product that you can click through. That's cheaper than building the whole thing. Because obviously one of the great things about the design process is you can test solutions without having to write a line of code. And if it's cheap to write lines of code, you should also launch it. But sometimes it's much more expensive to get a dev team of 5 or 6 people building a thing for 3 or 4 months when you can test it on a bit of paper or an interactive prototype. So you go through that kind of double diamond process again. But within the double diamond, I think it is about empowering your team with a range of tools, and so they know what tool to use. A classic example would be workshops. There are dozens and dozens of workshop activities you can do. Yes, sure, you can do the business model canvas. And maybe if you're a junior designer, like all you know in workshops is a business model canvas. And it's really, really good for 90% of the problems you meet. But you might find a different class of problem where actually that's not the right approach, that maybe using one of the Grove Partners kind of workshop models, or some of the stuff that Dave Gray and Sonny Brown have kind of worked on, might be more appropriate than the business model canvas. Possibly because the model's not appropriate, possibly because the executives you're working with have done 15 business model canvas exercises and are sick of them. So having a collection of tools and knowing when to use them and how to use them, and the ability to pivot, I think is really, really important. So not so much a fixed process, but a rich box of tools to draw upon.
Well, I'm thinking, because you mentioned the benefits of applying design thinking and design methods, really finding out in shorter time that something doesn't work. You doesn't have to spend a lot of money and resources on developing things before finding out that it's not working. You currently advise startups, but you also have experience with working with larger companies. Is there a difference how you approach startups and larger companies when explaining why they should invest in the design process, and what's the difference, basically?
I think there is. I think the difference is, can be subtle. They can also be quite unsubtle. But I think when it comes to how design can minimize risk, because what we're talking about here is risk, I think design is particularly good at understanding and minimizing the risk to a difficult to use interface, so usability. And we can put our interfaces in front of our customers, and we can very, very quickly figure out what's working and what's not working from a usability perspective. I think it's harder to put an interface in front of, or product in front of a customer from a design perspective and figure out whether it's a good business. Now, you can do that through some research, but again, even then, I think it's quite hard to research your way to the perfect solution. Because if you could do that, companies like Nokia would have beaten Apple. Nokia, back in the day, had amazing levels of design research. They'd come up with all kinds of brilliant solutions, and yet Apple outmaneuvered them. And they didn't outmaneuver them because of research, they outmaneuvered them because they delivered a better product. So I think when it comes to more established companies are more risk intolerant. And so if you already have a well-known, well-established brand, people trust you, if you're doing millions and millions and millions of pounds worth of business each year, and you're in a sector where if you mess up, you would lose the trust of your audience, then you need to be a little bit more risk averse. And so you can spend a bit more time doing research, testing on sample users, et cetera, and really, really honing the interface behind closed doors before you launch, because you want this launch to be good. It's never going to be perfect, it's never going to be brilliant. You need to have resources in order to kind of go in and fix all the bugs, because no strategy, survives contact with the enemy. No interface survives contact with the users. All of your best thought ideas of how the product would work is probably going to fall down in front of users. But you want it to be as good as possible. You want to think through all the edge cases. If you've got potentially hundreds of thousands of users, you want to make sure that you've not accessibility problems. You want to make sure you've not got problems with abuse or other areas that maybe a startup might not naturally be worried about, although they probably should. When you're when you're a startup and you don't have any reputation to worry about and you don't have large amounts of money to worry about, then there is an opportunity to be a little bit more risk averse. You also probably don't have the budget to do all of the initial big design upfront stuff to minimize risk. So what tends to happen is startups tend to release in the open under the understanding that things will be broken and fix as they go. Also, startups tend to not need to be perfect because what they're dealing with is they're dealing with often fairly early adopters in the early stages who just want the problem that you're solving to go away. And they really don't care whether the usability is a bit broken or wonky or whatever, because if they're getting value and utility for the product, what tends to happen is as those early adopters start to all be consumed by your product, later adopters start to come in. And these are the ones that are trying, probably now switching from a competitor. And they're the ones who are maybe a little bit more price sensitive, they're maybe a little bit more sensitive to usability, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you have a little bit more of a runway to produce and release mediocre work if it solves a problem as a startup for the first year or two until you start growing and so you start raising Series A, Series B. And then that's generally when startups like really double down on design because the growth starts to plateau and they start getting kind of people complaining about quality, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing I think to bear in mind is, and some of this is around kind of not looking at an individual startup, but looking at the startup ecosystem. Most startups fail. So I think backing up a second, a lot of designers want to go off and do a ton of research and make sure that the product is so perfect that it will never fail. But the cost of doing that is actually prohibitively high. So what the market generally looks for is it generally looks for 3 or 4 or 5 different startups in that realm. One of those 3 or 4 or 5 startups will succeed, the other 3 or 4 will fail. And the ones that succeed, then you kind of double down and you start fixing all the problems and all the bugs and all the issues. And so weirdly, the market starts to take care of some of the things the design team want to take care of, because actually it doesn't really matter in the ecosystem perspective if 2 or 3 of those companies do fail to the ecosystem. It does to the founders and it does to the designers. So I can totally understand why the designers are saying we need to do more work, we need to do research, we need to do all this kind of stuff. But I think these sort of market forces end up driving people to putting things out early, seeing what works, what doesn't, and doubling down.
Yeah, actually, this was one of my other questions. So I guess there are times when too much research or maybe too much designing is something that won't work. And designers love processes, methods. They love to really dig deeper into things, analyze it, and maybe what are the signs when you should really stop and let's say follow more your intuition and go maybe be more straightforward.
I mean, in a weird kind of way, it's not really fortunate, but I'm going to say fortunately, that's not a problem we really have that much. It's very rare that you see startups that are overfunding and overinvesting in design. In fact, typically what happens is they underinvest. So it's not a very common problem. I do say that maybe 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 startups I see that have this problem, and often actually it's a result of getting too much funding. If the company is quite lean, if they haven't got a large amount of funding, then they have to be really careful with how they spend their money. And usually they don't then spend a ton of it on design. And that's a problem in and of itself. But it means that the focus is not on going down rabbit holes and doing big design up front. The problem is actually the opposite problem, which is you're shipping stuff and sometimes it's not very good. But you do occasionally get companies that are really exciting, people put tons of money in, and then the founders, because their whole identity is associated with the brand and because they love design, they go and they hire an amazing design leader that's got credibility. They hire 2 or 3 designers. They work with the best design agency. And what ends up happening is you end up spending so much time building this kind of beautiful thing, big design up front, that then when it gets released, it still doesn't work because, even though you've got rid of all the usability problems and it looks beautiful, you haven't necessarily proved that this thing actually is wanted by anybody. And again, we see lots of examples of designs where people put a ton of money in, not only designs, products, put a ton of money in. We don't know if anyone wants it. I tweeted today about kind of Meta. Like Meta have been spending billions of pounds on their VR play, their virtual world play. And not even the Meta staff are using it that much because they're not necessarily seeing the value in it. And I think if your team are not dog fooding your own product because they're like, well, this is not super useful, maybe they haven't kind of validated the use case. And it might just be that, in terms of that particular example, they might just be too early. It might be that in 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years' time, it might be the perfect solution, but it might not be now. And I think this is a challenge. But going back to your point, like when I do see companies over-investing, it's wanting to build the perfect product in one go. You want the product to have all of the features, all the functionality that you believe is the right set of features and functionality, and then you launch it, and then you find that half of those features aren't used, or people didn't actually want this. They want this sort of small thing over here, and then you're going to spend a ton of money designing a thing that was wasted. And so I've seen a few startups where a year, 18 months in, they still haven't launched anything because they've got tons of money. They don't have to launch anything, but by the time they launch it, it's too late. They spent 18 months doing one iteration. Much better to have done 18 or 38 or whatever, like 60 iterations in that time because you're learning. And I think that's the key is, it's all very well doing design work as long as you're kind of learning. If you're only making hypotheses and assumptions, you want to get those assumptions tested as quickly as possible. You can do that with users, you can do that with usability testing, you can do that with other means, but actually putting it out into the market and seeing whether people really care is often the most efficient way of doing it. And a lot of the time, I think as designers, we have these hypotheses. We think users want X, and then when we put it out in the market, they don't. So I think sometimes designers think we know best, and because we often don't look at the analytics, aren't looped into the results, we often don't know what we don't know, and that can be quite damaging, I think.
And I guess this overinvestment into design, but it must not be only design. It probably is the execution or the delivery phase, I guess, and the problem, from my point of view, might be in that the startups or the companies, they don't invest much in the discovery phase, but they go to, let's say, this delivery phase where they are really building the details of the product. But like you said, the vision isn't validated yet. So
it's a difficult one because I think where startups are concerned, the founders of those companies have probably been thinking about this product for some time. They've probably been doing research in the form of desk research. They've been reading articles, they've been reading books, they've been reading magazines. They've probably, gone and talked to a lot of people in this space. It might not be considered classic research in the way that a design team would do it, but they're still, spending a lot of time talking and understanding. There's a good chance that the people who are designing this product actually come from that world. They might have worked in the sector for 2, 3, 4, 5 years and found, through their own real world usability tests that this is a problem and that's a problem and that doesn't work. And so I think a lot of the time when designers complain that founders haven't done the necessary research, actually what they mean is they haven't done formal structured research in the way we would like it to do. But actually what has happened is the founders have gone out there and they've done their own ad hoc research and they've come up with a bunch of hypotheses or a bunch of insights which they believe are important. And so I think we do need to, in the early stages, stop trying to be quite so formal, understand the work that has gone into forming this product and sort of cut the founders some slack. Now, I think that only lasts for a certain while. I think this is where the trap happens. I think, that first 6 months, that first year, you're building off of the founder's life experience up to that point. However, once you've launched the first product, 60% of it works, 40% of it doesn't. Then you have to start engaging with your users because you've kind of figured out now of all the insights that the founders had, these are the ones that work, these are the ones that doesn't. The problem I find is when you're working in a bigger company, and the CEO has been in this industry for 20 years and they really think they know all the solutions. This is how it's done, this is not how it's done. And there's no research or corroboration to back that up. But maybe those people actually haven't been on the coalface for 5 or 10 years. Maybe their view of the industry is really old-fashioned. You know, I suspect that, you know, the people who are, you know, running product at Photoshop, let's say, haven't, you know, designed an interface in anger using Photoshop for many years. But I can definitely tell you that the people that were designing Figma knew all the pain points because they were designing interfaces every single day. The folks at Photoshop, the product managers, were trying to balance multiple needs. Like, well, this is going to work for interface designers, but it's also got to work for, you know, photographers. It's also got to work for people that are doing sort of 3D visualizations. So we need to kind of do something for all these people. Whereas the folks at Figma are like, no, I'm using Figma to design Figma. I need to kind of have this feature, that feature, something else. So a lot of it also comes down to like how close you are with your market. If you're actually really, really close to your market, if you're a user, if you are your market, it's easier to get away with doing lighter levels of research than if you are distanced. If you're Basecamp and you're building a solution for yourself and, you know, 100,000 people like you, maybe the requirements to do research are lighter than if you're somebody that's building, I don't know, Notion or Evernote or, some other kind of sort of SaaS tool. And so there's no one size fits all, I think. I think, you know, you've got to apply your design and research common sense to every problem that comes at you. And I think the answer isn't always like, we need to do more research. I kind of joke sometimes that, you know, how many designers does it take to screw in a light bulb? Well, first we need to do a 6-month study into the role of light in society, which is a lot of how designers treat things. Like, well, where's the research? This light bulb needs changing. Well, you've got the poor product manager going, well, look, it's dark, I can't see. We just need to change the light bulb. Please just change the light bulb. And the designers are going, oh no, like, you know, we're just a feature factory here because we can't do the research. So there is an element of being pragmatic and having a level of balance there and understanding what needs to be researched and what doesn't.
Maybe back to the most of the market when the design is underfunded. So what I'm wondering is how, because you are helping designers become leaders and you are in this leadership, design leadership area. So how do you start a conversation with a company where you see a need for a design leadership? So how do you start there?
Well, I think there's two slightly different questions or conversations sort of trapped up in that question. So I think the first thing is like how your last bit of your question was like, how do you encourage companies to build out a design leadership function?
Yeah.
And generally that is just around often how the company scales. You know, from a startup perspective, what typically happens is you hire your first designer. And then they get really, really doing too much work. They're burnt out. They go, well, I need to hire a second designer. So you go, well, okay, that's great. You go and hire the person. And so you write the job spec and you do the interviews. And now suddenly there's a new person on the team and you're having to tell them how the company works. And then that person comes to you and says, look, actually, Andy, like, you know, I'm looking for a pay rise. And you go, oh, I haven't done that before. And then suddenly, like, you hire a third person, a fourth person, and then you're the manager. And that's typically what happens in those kind of organizations that are growing. Like, your roles and responsibilities grow at the pace of the startup. This is one of the reasons why I actually recommend a lot of people join startups, because if you are an ambitious designer that wants to be a design leader, your best way, I think, to become a design leader is to be sort of grandparented into that role. And by grandparent, I mean, like, you grow and you're forced to grow at the speed of the company. You know, if you don't do that and you go and join another company and you're waiting for your boss to retire or to leave, that could be 3 or 4 years. And you're waiting around for your boss to leave because you think you're going to get their job. And then when your boss leaves, they hire somebody else who is also head of design, and you never get the opportunity to have that role. Often then the only way that you can get a new role as head of design is you leave and you go to another company that wants head of design and you can convince them that you're the right person. So I think growing in a startup is one of the best ways of doing that. And then obviously, you know, once you've got a team of 5 or 6 people, you're having to struggle with a lot of the kind of the things of managing people, doing one-to-ones, career progression, etc., etc. And then you grow to like 20 people, and now you're not just managing designers, you're managing managers, and you probably never managed managers before. And then the other problem I think with growing inside a role is that also, if you're the only person that's ever been a design leader, you're not learning from a senior designer, and also you've not inherited any of the sort of the fundamentals. Like if you were to go and join a new company, if you're going to go and join an existing company that had a design leader for 10 years, you'll have processes, you'll have an interview schema, you'll have a career ladder, you'll have all this stuff. If you're the first designer, then the second designer, and you grow like that, you're going to have to make all this stuff up from scratch, which is hard, but you learn much, much faster. You learn much faster by doing. So I think it comes naturally if the company's growing. It comes naturally if you start to hire more and more people, and that's generally how people convince you to hire a design leader. The other question I think, which is sort of also where you were heading, is like, if you are a design leader, how do you convince your company to invest in design? How do you get them to hire that second, third, fourth designer? How do you get them to hire the first researcher? How do you get them to hire a strategist or a writer or whatever? I think the strategy that most novice designers take is one of trying to teach people. They'll go away and they go, we really, really need to have this extra, function. We need to hire a researcher. I'm going to go away and put a big deck together, and I'm going to go into my boss and I'm going to present the deck, and then they're going to cheer and clap and rise me up on their shoulders and sort of carry me out of the meeting room as a hero because I've done this kind of like amazing, kind of like presentation, everyone's going to believe it. That's not how change happens. Like, you'll go in, you'll probably do a terrible job because you'll be, Jared Spall says you need to do X, and like this book over here says you've got to do Y, and your boss will just be like, yeah, but how does this help us? Like, what is the bottom line? So you need to go in and you need to apply your empathy of your users to your bosses. What do they care about? What are they trying to get done? What isn't working? What's costing them money? What's a bottleneck? What's slowing things down? And how can you position design as a way to solve those problems? Often it's not through a single presentation. Often it's through having lots of coffees with people. Often it's through befriending your CTO and going, okay, Hakim or Adil or whatever the CTO's name is, you've got 20 engineers with there's only one designer. Like, am I slowing you down? And well, actually, yeah, we're having to do a lot of design work because, we're using all these UI kits because we did not get enough. Okay, well, how would you feel about like next time you have some headcount, putting a designer our way? Oh yeah, that makes sense. That will speed things up. A lot of it is through this horse trading. A lot of it is through building relationships, and then explaining to people not what the value of design is from a theoretical point of view, but just saying, hey, look, if we can hire a researcher, we can speed things up for you. Talking to one person I'm coaching, where their company has got 50 analytics people and 2 researchers. And it's like there's clearly an imbalance there. So you need to go there and you need to explain how actually, you don't maybe need this number of analytics people because the researchers can go and do start taking a qualitative look at some of the work you're doing, or similarly, like I'm seeing a real trend at the moment with product teams having 10 PMs and 3 designers. What's ended up happening is the PMs are doing design, and because the PMs are so busy doing design, they ask for another PM and they get it, and they ask for another PM and get it, and suddenly all your design work's being done by the PMs. As a designer, you need to do a much better job of explaining, well, hey, look, actually, like the stuff you're doing there, that is a designer's role. Can we, let's hire another designer and actually free your PMs up to do the stuff that they're better at, more efficient at. So yeah, it's a long, slow conversation, and it generally doesn't happen through a once a year, 10-minute slot in a strategy session to the CEO.
You actually got to my other question, and that's I'm pretty interested in this relationship between product managers and designers, because I see a lot of overlaps between the roles. So how do you see it? How the two should cooperate, and where's the overlap, and where are the borders, maybe where they should divide the roles?
Yep. I mean, I am, like a lot of people, a big fan of the idea of like having a product trifecta. So on a product team, you will have a product manager, a designer, an engineer that create this little sort of like trifecta, this little, kind of triplet or whatever you want to call it, of skills, and you work together as a group to solve the problems. And ideally, no one person is in charge. But if you're the engineering person, you have more say over engineering stuff. If you're a design person, you have more say over design and user-based stuff. If you're the product person, you have slightly more say over the product and the business outcomes. But you should be working together. And that can work really well if everybody's strengths are recognized and if everybody is kind of seen as an equal partner. It doesn't work well if there's a hierarchy. It doesn't work well if the product manager is responsible for making all the decisions, and every time a designer says, I think we should do X, they go, no, we're not going to do that because it doesn't allow us to do X, Y, Z. And so I think the relationship can be really, really good if the product managers understand the role of design and the designers understand the role of product and they work in harmony. It tends to work really, really poorly if the designers are seen purely as a delivery mechanism for the product manager, and the product manager is basically telling everyone what to do. I'm going to go off and I'm going to do the research. I'm not going to involve you. Not only am I not going to involve you, I'm not going to tell you what the outcomes are. I'm not going to show you the results of the research. I'm going to go away and I'm going to decide what we're going to build. I'm going to tell you what we're going to build. You're going to build it and you've got no context. That can be a deeply unsatisfying role for a designer, because designers really, really thrive from understanding the context of the problem they're solving. And if they're not allowed to understand the context, I think you can still produce really good work without understanding the context, but it's just unsatisfying. And it goes against everything that we've been taught as designers, how to approach design. So it can be really frustrating. I think designers need to be a little bit more pragmatic. We are not working in Apple a lot of the time. We're working in companies that don't get design. I think delivery is a big part of what we do. The reality is that most companies aren't going out there and doing all this amazing research. And our goal is to try and push for it and encourage us to do more, but not to the point that we start just being annoying and being seen as kind of like slightly needy children that why can't I have a pony? You need that balance. I think the other thing is I think there are big cultural differences between different kinds of product managers. There are a lot of product managers that come from a project management background and are just taskmasters. They are just like are helping the flow of delivery. And it can be quite challenging to step up and outside of that flow if your product manager is having that sort of slightly more directive kind of delivery focus. It can also be quite difficult if your product manager is more of a traditional MBA kind of like head in a spreadsheet, kind of running the numbers kind of person, when they're only trying to deliver business outcomes. They can also be brilliant if you're good at being able to communicate how design can deliver those outcomes, but most designers I think aren't as good at that as they think they are, and so they can get a little bit stuck. Often, obviously, you also get product managers that are very engineering focused, but I think the best product managers that work best with designers obviously are the design focused ones, the ones that are trying to deliver a great user experience, that believe that to some extent a product with the best user experience has the highest chance of commercial success. And I'm seeing a lot more designers decide to move into product management because they want to have more influence over the overall direction of their products. And so, yeah, I think that there are groupings that work really, really well, and there are groupings that work less well.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting idea, because from my experience, most of the time I see a product manager as, let's say, the head of the group, or really making the decisions. But I can see product managers that are really open to input, and they treat the role more like I'll get inputs and then I'll make the decision, but I will really listen to what the designer brings to the table and make the decisions based on what he says or she says. And sorry.
Well, no, just to say, I think the problem really is the title manager. Product manager has the word manager in it, which often makes people feel that they are the ones that are in charge and they are the ones that are making decisions. But that's not really meant to be the case. The ideal is that you are all equal partners. But I think the fact that I'm a designer, I'm an engineer, I'm a product manager, kind of ends up implying a hierarchy just because of the language that's been used. And then that hierarchy goes to people's heads. And I think that, 3 or 4 years ago, there was a trend of people saying, hey, like the product manager is like the CEO of the product. It's like, well, they're not really actually. And actually, if they were the CEO, they'd probably listen a little bit more than they do. So I don't think the product manager should be the one that's in charge of the product. I think the product team, I think the trifecta, I think it should be an equal balance between design, engineering, and product. And if you have to have a hierarchy, then I think, if you hit an impasse, then maybe the product manager, is a tiebreaker. But I'd say not even that. I'd say if you reach an impasse on an engineering problem, maybe the engineering lead is the tiebreaker. If you're, hitting an impasse when it comes to user experience, maybe the user experience lead is the tiebreaker. And maybe if it's a business outcome, then the business representative in terms of product manager is a tiebreaker. And I think it has to be negotiated. And I think if your attitude is, I'm the product manager, I have final say, you do what I say, then you're going to end up with a lot of very dictatorial product leaders, and that is going to not be a nice environment for designers or engineers to work in, unfortunately.
Okay. You mentioned that Meta is currently experiencing issues with their metaverse and things like that. What we see now is, let's say, maybe a beginning of a crisis in the tech segment, where large companies are letting people go and they are undergoing restructuring and so on. We see it at Stripe, we see it at Meta. Elon Musk is doing this at Twitter. So do you think there is an opportunity for design leadership in this what's happening? How do you see this?
I mean, I think, again, it's a bit of a challenging question, because I think actually you need to have more leadership across all of the organizations in times of crisis. If you're growing, people are throwing money at you, if someone leaves, you can just hire somebody else, then you can actually have really inefficient and really bad leaders, because it doesn't matter. And I'm not saying you should do that, but I think in a lot of tech companies, they often have very, very bad leaders, because if you're a terrible leader and you upset all your team members and they disappear, you just hire more people and you blame all those people. I think when there's a crisis, when you've had to let a large, sizable sum of your team go, the other people, there's a lot of reasons why people might have to stay. They might have to stay because their visa depends on it. They might have to stay because their healthcare depends on it. They might have to stay because their job depends on it. But there is a lot more flexibility in roles in the tech industry than there are in many other industries. And so now, if you're a terrible leader, there's much more chance that you're going to demoralize your team. They're either going to stay and quit, or they're going to leave, and you're in a much more tricky situation, because you might not be able to find replacements. So I think you've got to be a great leader. You've got to be motivating. You've got to be inspiring. You've got to be thoughtful and caring. More so when things are down. I hate using kind of wartime analogies, but you can probably be a terrible leader if you're leading a team of soldiers on a parade ground. It's a very different matter if you're in a trench and you're being bombed. You've got to be that inspiring kind of thoughtful person to kind of get people through what can often be a really, really challenging time. Sadly, I know people at some of the companies you've mentioned who are leading teams, and they've had to, they've been forced by the circumstances, by the environment, by the economy to make those cuts. And, that's a really, it's a horrible situation to be in, to find yourself out of work, as a designer or an engineer, but it's also quite tough to be the person that's doing that, particularly if you've built a team around friendship and family and, all in it together. you don't make half of your family redundant when times are hard, but you might find yourself in a situation where you have to do that with your team. And so you've got to approach it with compassion. You've got to approach it with understanding. You've got to be a resilient leader. You've got to be a caring leader. A lot of the people I know that have had to make their teams redundant are doing everything they can to make that the least painful experience possible. It's still going to be painful, but they're trying to find them new jobs. They're putting lists together and using their network to help them land in their next place. And so I think in challenging times you need to be a better leader rather than a worse one.
And is there an opportunity for like a design competence to really grow maybe during the crisis, really finding its way more into the leadership, because I think those actions that are happening right now are driven by some business effectivity maybe, and maybe design can play a more vital role in this in the future. What do you think about this?
I would like to believe that was the case, but I don't think I believe that is the case. I think that a lot of teams have been cut. I think that lack of resources means that it's going to be really hard for those teams to deliver, because what's going to be happening is a lot of teams have been cut, but a lot of the roadmap probably won't be. And so you're going to suddenly have a team of 10 designers, now a team of 5 designers, but still being expected to deliver as much probably over the next year, which means they're probably not going to be able to do all the things they want to do. They're probably not going to be able to do all the research they want to do. They're probably not going to be able to do all the validation. So I think it's going to be harder. I think a lot of designers will moan and complain and gnash their teeth, and that's understandable, and they'll complain that this is not the double diamond process that we all promised. But it's a really, really challenging time, and I think if you are a designer that's in a company, that's in a job, you might have to be a little bit more pragmatic over the next couple of years, and you might find that you'll have to deliver some value, you'll have to demonstrate the value that you and your team can bring, not through PowerPoint decks and theoretical conversations, by delivering value. And if you can continuously deliver value and demonstrate that value, then you can start to kind of build up your position and your resources again. But I think it's going to be a tough couple of years for lots of people. A lot of teams are now going to be just focusing very, very heavily on a few specific metrics. And if as designers we can deliver those metrics, great. But if we can't, then the resources will go to people that can.
Yeah, I'm still wondering because it's been said that the companies that invest during crisis usually go through it like winners. So I'm wondering if this is something that can even happen to design. That really companies that want really go maximum cost effectiveness and will keep some innovation and focus on this can gain some leverage during the crisis. So.
The challenge is you have to have the money to invest. If you're Apple and you've got billions of pounds in the bank, it's easy to say, yeah, we should invest during a crisis. If you don't have billions of dollars in the bank, actually if you've got an increasingly small sum of money in the bank and the market isn't wanting to put a load of money in your startup because they're nervous around where the industry's going, then you just might, in all likelihood, find you don't have the money to invest. The people who are cutting teams are often not cutting teams because they've got loads of money in the bank and they're doing it for fun. They're doing it because they think that they are going to have to survive for another 18 months longer than they thought they had, and they're having to make really, really sort of tough decisions around how they elongate their runway to stay alive longer. And if they're trying to stay alive, they're not going to want to invest. It's a bit like saying oh, we've had a plane crash and half of our food has just gone, and you're like, oh, let's have a feast to celebrate. And it's like, well, yeah, that might make everyone feel good, but then we'll have even less food left to survive the next 18 months. Like what we actually need to do is cut down and be a bit more economical here. So I don't think there are going to be many people who are in a position to invest in the way you suggest. The only way you can, well, not the only way, but the main way you can do that as a design team is by generating your own money. By going, okay, well, there's no external investment here, but if we can make our company more profitable, if we can demonstrate that design, for every dollar you spend on design, we give you 5 back, then if you spend $1 and we give you 5 back, maybe next year you'll spend $2. And then we'll give you 10 back, and then maybe you spend $3 and we give you 15 back. And you'll slowly demonstrate your value through delivery, I would say. The other thing is, I think a lot of it is around, again, being pragmatic. I'm very, very interested in the area of growth design. I'm really interested in product-led growth. If you as a design team can say, okay, we've gone through a real crisis here, we're knuckling down, and what we need to do as a design team is we need to deliver growth. We're going to stop all of these other kind of slightly more fanciful, innovative products that might not go anywhere, and we are going to spend the next 6 months or a year delivering growth. If you can do that, if you can demonstrate how product-led growth is flowing to your bottom line, then you'll keep getting more budget. Maybe that budget will come from marketing because they were spending money on marketing, but half of the marketing money was disappearing, or they're spending a ton of money on expensive advertising campaigns. If you can demonstrate how your design team is adding to customer acquisition costs or lifetime value or payback period or whatever it is, you're much more likely to be a winner in this space. I would also say, though, just to finally wrap that up, is a lot of the teams that are being cut, design is maybe not being cut as much. And often it's because a lot of companies claim that they are customer-centric. Often they're not as customer-centric as we would like them to be, but it's really, really difficult to claim publicly you're a customer-centric company if you cut a big part of the team that's delivering that customer centricity. So I am seeing companies where, 20 engineers are being cut and only 1 or 2 designers. Or maybe the design team is not being cut, but they're not being given budget to grow. And so I think we need to understand our privilege. If we are in that privileged position, we might not be, but if lots of your colleagues have been made redundant, don't be suddenly going, well, that's all very well, I've just lost half our engineering team, but I really think that we should follow the double diamond process and hire five researchers. It's kind of, potentially a little bit kind of tone deaf.
So basically, the advice here will be to really maybe spend some time researching how I affect the bottom line of the company, how I really, or my design team is helping create value there, acquiring customers, maybe lowering costs somewhere, and so on, and then bring it to the table and focus on this kind of things.
And it's difficult to do, if you're in a delivery role where you're just being told to build stuff and somebody else is deciding it. The key is to try and find some ability to impact your roadmap, so you can say we should do X, and then the thing we said that you should do has had this positive effect. And so it's tough, but it's also weirdly it's not something we should just be doing in a downturn. We should be doing it all the time. We are being hired by companies to deliver some kind of outcome, not just an output, but an outcome. We should constantly be asking ourselves, how are we contributing to this? Not how are we contributing to the kind of, the great design sort of God in the sky, but how are we actually using design to help our company do the things it needs to do? So yeah, maybe us going through a bit of a challenging financial time might be a wake-up call, but actually it's waking us up to all the things we probably should be doing already.
Okay. I think we are out of time, so thank you very much, Andy. That was very inspiring and with a great advice at the end, I think. Yeah, thank you.
It's been my pleasure.